Thank you for watching Amir 5858. I am Amir. I am thankful to all news resources and my entire team. Following news has been reported by American, European, Asian, Australian, African and Canadian channels, and of course the news agencies AFP, AP and Reuters. Now the news headlines. Tens of thousands of Israelis celebrate Passover in displacement. Killing in Gaza continue. Palestinian protests continue all over the US in college campuses. Seafood and forced labor of North Korean. America sending new arm package to Ukraine, which included air defense system. Mr. Blinken asked China to stop arming Russia. King Charles will start his public duty from next week. Menthol cigarettes will continue in US. Salmonella chicken Tesla car under investigation. On Wall Street, Dow Jones Industrial, Nasdaq and S&P 500 all went up. Now the news in detail.
But often the
world every weekend. We'll cover all the ground on all four corners of the world.
Come with me around the world every weekend on France 24. Hello and welcome to Daybreak here on France 24. We'll be with you until 10 a.m. Paris time. Here are this morning's main news headlines. As further airstrikes are reported in southern Gaza overnight, Hamas says it's received and is studying a counter-proposal from Israel aimed at reaching potential ceasefire after more than 6 months of war. As pro-Palestinian protests continue across major US college campuses, policymakers at the school at the epicenter of the movement, Columbia University in New York, passed a resolution to investigate how the leadership of the institution has been handling the demonstrations. And after being passed over to French organisers, the Olympic flame is set to set sail from Greece later this Saturday before making landfall in the southern city of Marseille in just under 2 weeks' time. With us. Well, first this hour to the war in Gaza. Hamas says it's studying the latest Israeli counter-proposal regarding a potential ceasefire and the release of the remaining hostages still being held by the Palestinian militant group. It had delivered its proposal to Egyptian and Qatari mediators earlier this month. Hamas is insisting on a permanent ceasefire, an option that's opposed by Israel. A delegation from Egypt is believed to have arrived in Israel on Friday in a bid to reignite stalled truce negotiations. Let's hear from AP journalist John Gambrell, who's based in the region.
Egypt's top intelligence official is in Israel. He's part of a delegation that's here trying to reach any kind of terms for a ceasefire in the Israeli war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, this has been described as sort of a last-ditch effort ahead of a possible Israeli ground offensive in Rafah. That's that city in the southern Gaza Strip where half of Gaza's 2.3 million people now live. The Israelis, in footage that the Associated Press has gathered, have already put armored personnel carriers, tanks, and other equipment in southern Israel, potentially preparing for that ground offensive. We've also seen tents starting to be built north of Rafah, suggesting that there might be this ground offensive. Now, it hasn't started yet, and the Israelis still want to try to get some of those over 100 hostages believed to still be held in the Gaza Strip back to Israel. Those negotiations are ongoing, and it remains unclear whether or not there'll be a breakthrough. But as of right now, the threat of that Rafah offensive remains real, and this does seem to be an effort to try to halt it.
The UN says the war has turned the besieged territory into a humanitarian hellscape amid fears of a looming famine. It comes as the EU commits to providing an additional €68 million in desperately needed aid to Gaza, and as the US begins construction of a temporary pier and causeway off the coast designed to help facilitate the delivery of aid. The structure is expected to be ready by early next month, as Cami Knight explains.
The building of a floating pier off Gaza's coast is finally underway. More than 1,000 US troops were involved in the operation that should help deliver more aid to the besieged strip.
I can confirm that US military vessels, to include the USNS Benavides, have begun to construct the initial stages of the temporary pier and causeway at sea.
Ships will deliver aid from Cyprus to the pier, where it will be loaded onto trucks to transfer across Gaza. US troops will be several hundred meters from the beach as they operate the system, allowing forces to avoid stepping on the ground.
When it comes to the temporary pier and the causeway, those are being constructed offshore, out at sea, and are essentially nowhere near mortar range.
Once completed in early May, the pier should eventually allow for the delivery of up to 150 truckloads of aid per day. But a senior Biden official says aid will also need to pass through Israeli checkpoints on land, despite having been already inspected in Cyprus, raising questions about possible delays even after it reaches shore. The United Nations says Israel's operation has turned Gaza into a humanitarian hellscape amid fears of a looming famine. It says the daily average number of trucks entering Gaza during April was 200, less than half of the minimum UN requirements.
As pro-Palestinian protests spread across US college campuses, pressure is mounting on the head of Columbia University after the facility's Senate, a policy-making body representing students and staff, voted to approve a resolution calling for an investigation into the school's leadership. The university's president has faced fierce criticism over the use of police against demonstrators. Students there say they intend to continue their encampment until their demands are met. Charlotte Hughes has more.
A statue of George Washington, wrapped in a Palestinian flag, on the campus of this American university. Students here and across the US have been gathering to protest against the war in Gaza.
we just don't feel that our universities are universities that we want to be at and we want to go to. And so we created essentially our own university, our own space. It's a place that we believe all Palestinians deserve the right to be free.
From LA to New York, Chicago to Boston, the protests have intensified. They have unfolded at some of the world's most prestigious universities, including Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Princeton. Many demonstrators were calling on their schools to divest from companies involved in Israel's military.
The students and other protesters are planning on staying here until all of the demands have been met, which include divesting from anything that has to do with the genocide.
Over in New York, the president of Columbia University is facing mounting pressure. On Friday, a university oversight panel denounced her administration for a crackdown on a protest that saw police arrest more than 100 people. Demonstrators, gathering for the 10th consecutive day, said they were at an impasse with administrators.
With our demand regarding financial disclosure, there is some progress in that. However, our main demand, which is divestment from the Israeli occupation, there's an impasse in that.
Universities in some cases have called on police to evacuate students, with some accusing the protesters of trespassing and of fueling anti-Semitism on campus. In the last week, more than 500 arrests have been made across major US universities in relation to the protests. Demonstrators and activists have denied accusations of anti-Semitism and say they are being silenced for expressing a political opinion.
Here in France, students are also demanding a ceasefire in Gaza and calling for their institutions to sever ties with Israel. Paris's prestigious Sciences Po says it's come to an agreement with the hundreds of pro-Palestinian demonstrators who've been staging sit-ins and protests at the 150-year-old university. Police moved in on Friday when demonstrators clashed with several dozen pro-Israel protesters.
Tense scenes here in front of Sciences Po as a confrontation arose between pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian protesters, with police keeping the two groups away from each other. Friday saw the third day of demonstrations here at the prestigious university in Paris, where pro-Palestinian students have been blocking access to the building and urging the institution to condemn Israel's actions in Gaza.
We have hundreds of people coming, new faces that we've never seen before, and people really mobilizing, and professors as well. So I think it's our responsibility as academics, as students, to act when international law is not respected, specifically in Palestine when a genocide is happening. We as students in international relations and political sciences, we cannot stay silent.
The students received a message of support from the France-unbowed party leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon and were joined by elected officials from his party. Among them was Rima Hassan, a Franco-Palestinian activist and candidate for the European Parliament elections.
I'm asking Sciences Po to offer them their spaces for democratic debate and not to send in the CRS riot police to silence them.
The Council of Jewish Institutions in France, meanwhile, has condemned what they call a dangerous movement. The university's interim director condemned the blockade. Later Friday, the administration said that it had reached an agreement with the demonstrators after committing to holding a discussion about students' demands next week.
Let's move on to other world news. Clear-eyed about the challenges, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been holding talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, stressing the importance of responsibly managing the differences between Washington and Beijing as the two sides butt heads over a number of contentious bilateral, regional and global issues. Blinken says he raised concerns about China's support for Russia as well as other issues, including Taiwan and the South China Sea and human rights. With more on what was discussed, here's our Beijing correspondent, Yanali.
The tone coming from both sides, the US and China, a lot more cordial than we've seen in recent years, but the content still very much tense. And to illustrate, President Xi Jinping of China said earlier on Friday that China is happy to see a confident, open, prosperous and thriving United States, and we hope that the US can also look at China's development in a positive light, end quote. Beijing accuses Washington of stifling its growth, whilst Washington is concerned about cheap Chinese goods flooding its market and security issues concerning Chinese technology. Before leaving the country, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, reassured Beijing that Washington is not looking to decouple and that the US wants to see the Chinese economy grow, but that the way it grows matters. On international issues too, we've seen some polite but stern words. Beijing's close relationship with Moscow has been under the spotlight notably, and Blinken has once again accused China of being the top supplier of Russia's defense industrial base, whilst also adding, though, that China's voice has been very important in the past and had potentially helped convince Moscow steer away from nuclear weapons earlier on in the conflict. The Sino-US relationship appears a little more stable than we had seen when it hit rock bottom in the 2022-2023 years, and there are some areas, of course, where both sides could see eye to eye, such as counter-narcotics and academic exchanges. But all in all, the overall ties remain as complex as ever. Indeed, the list of contentious issues is very long. There's also human rights, Taiwan, the South China Sea, TikTok, chips, and many more.
Yanali reporting. Well, it's set to depart for France later this Saturday on a 19th century sailing ship after being handed over to Olympic organisers at a ceremony in the all-marble stadium where the first modern games were held in Athens in 1896. The flame will make its way across the Mediterranean to make landfall 12 days later in the southern port city of Marseille ahead of a torch relay through France leading to the opening ceremony in Paris on July 26th. Jenny Shen has the story.
This is the old port in Marseille, and this is what it will look like on the 8th of May. A change of scenery to welcome the Olympic flame, much to the excitement of these residents.
It's going to be amazing, the Olympic flame. We are Olympians. We're going to have a great day. Let's hope the weather holds up, so as not to extinguish the flame.
Finally, we stopped talking about Paris. Marseille, it's in Marseille.
It will be a historic moment, the first time the flame will arrive in the host country, elsewhere than the host city. The torch will be accompanied by an armada of over 1,000 boats. The Belém, which will be carrying the flame, will dock alongside this floating athletics track. That will be at 7 p.m. 45 minutes later, the Olympic cauldron will be lit by the torchbearer, whose identity still remains a mystery. In Marseille, there's one name on everyone's lips, one of the city's favorite sons, Zinedine Zidane.
It's time now for our focus report, which takes us to the US and increasing concerns about how AI technology is being used to influence elections and public opinion. Deepfake pornography is also being weaponized against prominent women like Taylor Swift, but also other women and teenage girls who aren't in the media spotlight. Some of them are fighting back. Our correspondent, Jessica Lemazurier, has been meeting one of them. She sent us this report.
Francesca Mani has found herself facing an invisible opponent: artificial intelligence.
A group of boys from our school took pictures of girls' faces and put them on AI pornographic images. They just said I was an AI confirmed victim. I was in shock. I started to feel a little sad, but that's when I went outside in the hallway and that's when I saw a group of boys kind of mocking a group of girls that were laughing about it. And then I was just...
Francesca Mani has found herself facing an invisible opponent: artificial intelligence.
A group of boys from our school took pictures of girls' faces and put them on AI pornographic images. They just said I was an AI confirmed victim. I was in shock. I started to feel a little sad, but that's when I went outside in the hallway and that's when I saw a group of boys kind of mocking a group of girls that were laughing about it. And then I was just super mad and I came to my mom and talked about it and we needed to do something.
The then 14-year-old, who lives in a New Jersey suburb, was notified by her school's administration last October that she was amongst a group of girls who'd had fake nude images made of them using artificial intelligence. The images had been circulated on Snapchat. The boy responsible was only suspended for 2 days.
It was just uncomfortable knowing that the group of boys were in my classes too, and that one person was also in one of my classes. We checked if what had happened to me was illegal, and it was not. It was legal, and we couldn't do anything about it. I have not seen those images. I don't think I would want to see those.
Francesca's mother, Dorota, filed a complaint, but in the United States there are no federal laws banning AI-generated deepfakes. The complaint was quickly dismissed.
Do you want to do the whole box? Is that much? The whole? Yeah. Yeah? Okay.
Dorota contacted local lawmakers and they got to work on legislation to make deepfake porn a crime.
It was legal. You couldn't really do anything about it. And the schools also didn't have any AI school policies in there too, so you really didn't know what to do.
I was furious, and I got even more mad when Francesca came in, and she was as furious as I was. Since the beginning of times, women have to fight for our rights and the consent. It's the biggest issue here. As simple as that, consent.
Another of the teen victims, who wishes to remain anonymous, is taking direct legal action against her classmate. Her lawsuit, filed in February, says that she suffered substantial emotional distress and damage to her reputation. It demands financial compensation. The lawsuit names the app used to make the images Clothoff. The app is easy to access and inexpensive. It can remove clothes from any photo. Its secretive founders are thought to be based in Belarus. This is the type of technology that was used to target former Biden administration official Nina Jankovic, an expert on disinformation. She's on a panel at Columbia University with Hillary Clinton in attendance. Studies reveal that deepfake pornography accounts for 98% of the total deepfake videos online. It's a phenomenon that almost exclusively targets women, oftentimes in an attempt to shame them into silence. Deepfakes of Nina were made from her official portrait. It had been picked up by right-wing media angry about her role in the Biden administration. Online trolls turned it into pornography.
It looks like me a little bit, but it doesn't really, again, because it's trained on this very specific portrait of me, and I can tell that it's trained on that. But no, I didn't watch the whole thing. I mean, they're each about 7 minutes long. It's a lot to subject yourself to.
Part of the problem is that the apps used to make this pornography are so easily available.
This technology has become entirely democratized now, and it's being deployed not only against celebrities like Taylor Swift or public figures like me, it's being deployed against ordinary people, moms, young women in middle and high school whose classmates are making these images of them.
Nudifying apps, all of these things that exist need to absolutely be taken off app stores and marketplaces.
Teenage girls in the US and beyond are now having to confront this epidemic of deepfake porn. Policy experts at the United Nations are concerned about the global rise of this technology. These AI images exist in the virtual space, but they have real-world impact.
You have to teach boys how to respect women and how to be responsible online in the same way that you have to teach girls. We know that young girls and young women do experience disproportionate levels of violence as well. And they may be in a position where they have less knowledge about their rights, about who to report to. Many often blame themselves as well. And because of the technology and the potential for piling on and for sharing and resharing their images, the impact on mental health is enormous and has resulted in death by suicide by a number of girls.
Dorota and Francesca have been invited to the White House. They've now made multiple trips to DC to lobby for a bipartisan bill that would make sharing sexually explicit deepfakes a crime and allow victims to sue people who create and distribute them. It's called the Defiance Act.
This issue, unfortunately, is broader than just teenagers in high schools. We talk about predators and pedophiles that are using it to hurt others. So I think laws and legislation, it's so crucial. Quite successful today. Definitely, yes. Monday, White House. Yeah. Tuesday, Capitol.
This mother-daughter duo refuse to be victims. They'll keep fighting until the law catches up with this fast-paced technology.
It's time now for sports news. And this morning we're kicking off with French football action.
Good evening, I'm Amna Navaz. Jeff Bennett is away. On the News Hour tonight, Israelis celebrate Passover as tens of thousands remain displaced and the war with Hamas rages on. As college protests against Israel's war in Gaza spread, a look at how they compare to demonstrations of the past. And a new investigation reveals how some of the seafood that ends up on our plates is produced by the forced labor of North Koreans.
The globalized world we live in, and the way that seafood in particular largely routes through China, means that many, if not most, brands in the US are tainted by this.
broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the News Hour. Egypt has sent a high-level delegation to Israel tonight, hoping to revive talks for a hostage deal and ceasefire with Hamas. But Cairo also warned against an Israeli assault on the southern Gaza city of Rafah, along the border with Egypt. Much of Gaza has already been reduced to a wasteland, with UN officials estimating 37 million tons of debris to be removed. They said today that the cleanup operation will be a mammoth job.
With 100 trucks, we're talking about 14 years of work with 100 trucks. So that's based on that figure, 14 years to remove, with approximately 750,000 workdays, person workdays, to remove the debris. So significant numbers when it comes to debris.
The UN said roughly 65% of the buildings destroyed in Gaza have been residential ones. The U.S. military today announced a new weapons package to rearm Ukraine's air defenses. It includes more Patriot missiles, but not the additional Patriot batteries that Ukraine had wanted. Still, in Washington, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said he believes this package, along with other weapons, will meet Ukraine's needs.
They need other types of systems and interceptors as well. And so I would caution us all in terms of making Patriot the silver bullet. I would say that it's gonna be the integrated air and missile defense, as we said so many times before, that really turns the tide.
The new weapons package will cost them $6 billion. It's part of $61 billion in military aid that Congress approved after months of deadlock. Meanwhile, another member of the Biden cabinet, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, warned Chinese President Xi Jinping today against supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. The two men met in Beijing. Blinken said he told Xi that China must stop supplying Russia with critical war materiel or the U.S. will act. He did not elaborate, but he did acknowledge progress in other areas.
We are committed to maintaining and strengthening the lines of communication between us so that we avoid any miscommunications, any misperceptions, any miscalculations. And we are committed to responsibly managing the relationship.
For his part, Xi said China and the U.S. must seek common ground rather than engage in what he called, quote, vicious competition. Britain's King Charles will return to public duties next week after a 3-month break for cancer treatment. Buckingham Palace said today that doctors are very encouraged by his progress so far. The palace has not yet said what kind of cancer the king has. Here at home, the Biden administration has again delayed a ban on menthol cigarettes. Javier Becerra, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, announced that today, saying, quote, it's clear that there are still more conversations to have, and that will take significantly more time. The ban could have angered black voters since 80% of black smokers use menthol cigarettes. U.S. poultry producers will have to cut salmonella bacteria in some chicken products to very low levels to prevent food poisoning. A final Agriculture Department regulation issued today applies to frozen, breaded, and stuffed raw chicken. It takes effect next year. Salmonella poisoning causes roughly 420 deaths and 1.3 million infections annually in the U.S. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is investigating whether last year's Tesla recall went far enough. The software update aimed to keep drivers alert while using the autopilot feature, but there have been more crashes since then. Today, the agency said the autopilot feature, quote, may lead drivers to believe that the automation has greater capabilities than it does. And on Wall Street, strong earnings at Microsoft and Alphabet pushed the stock market higher. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 153 points to close at 38,239. The Nasdaq rose 316 points. The S&P 500 added 51. Still to come on the News Hour, the connection between forced North Korean labor and some of the seafood that ends up on American plates. David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart weigh in on the week's political headlines. Musician John Bon Jovi on the new docuseries capturing the highs and the lows of his Grammy Award-winning band's 4 decades together.
This is the PBS News Hour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
This week, Jews around the world are observing Passover, the festival of liberation that marks the historic exodus from ancient Egypt. But this year, joy is tempered with loss and trauma. More than 160,000 Israelis will mark the holiday while displaced from their homes as the war with Hamas continues. Still others have empty chairs at the dinner table, their loved ones still held captive by Hamas. Ali Rogan has more.
In the rugged hills of northern Israel, Metula's mayor patrols his town where now no one lives.
See, this is Lebanon.
Lebanon is so close, Rogan.
One of the biggest developments of this week has been the expansion of college protests and encampments. Encampments continue to pop up, including today at the University of North Carolina. Meanwhile, protesters at Columbia University say they cannot reach an agreement with the school and intend to keep theirs going indefinitely. Hundreds of students have been arrested and charges have been brought against some students as well during clashes.
Overnight, more violent clashes between pro-Palestinian protesters and police, this time at Ohio State University. Officers moved to disperse a crowd after an hours-long demonstration citing rules banning overnight events. More than a dozen people were arrested. The latest wave of protests and encampments followed demonstrations at Columbia University last week. Similar scenes have popped up at scores of other colleges over the last several days and have led to hundreds of arrests. Video from Emory University yesterday shows officers pinning a...
Stephen Mintz from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Welcome.
In our interconnected, globalized economy, goods produced in one nation end up on shelves and in stores halfway around the world. And while consumers hope there's some way to protect the workers who make the products we buy, some American companies have recently come under scrutiny for alleged links to forced labor. William Brangham speaks with the journalist behind a new investigation documenting the forced labor behind Chinese seafood that ends up on American plates.
In recent years, Americans have been eating increasing amounts of seafood. It's considered one of the healthy... Ian Urbina, the project is called the Outlaw Ocean Project. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Legal cases involving former President Trump and some of his closest associates play out in state courts, the Supreme Court, and the Court of Public Opinion. Meanwhile, as foreign aid begins to arrive in Ukraine and the Middle East, protests boil over on campuses across the U.S. For more on a consequential week overseas and here at home, we turn to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That is New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for the Washington Post. Great to see you both. So a big week when it comes to the legal battles surrounding former President Trump. Let's start. David Brooks, always good to see you.
Thanks, Anna.
Few musical acts have enjoyed the success and the long run of the legendary band Bon Jovi. And a revealing new documentary series premiering tonight on Hulu tracks the highs and the lows of the Grammy Award-winning band's 4 decades together. Recently, Jeff Bennett spoke with frontman John Bon Jovi about Thank You, Good Night, the Bon Jovi story. It's for our arts and culture series, Canvas.
John Bon Jovi, welcome to the NewsHour.
Thank you, Jeff. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you here. This docuseries is a real honest look at the band's movie. The new docuseries is Thank You, Good Night, the Bon Jovi story, streaming now on Hulu and Disney+. Really great to talk with you.
And you, buddy. Thank you.
It's my life, it's now or never.
Later tonight on PBS, actor John Lithgow goes back to school. In Art Happens Here with John Lithgow, the author and humorist shares his passion for arts education, trying his hand at pottery, printmaking, dancing, and singing.
Snowflakes.
10 p.m. Eastern, right here on PBS. And be sure to tune into Washington Week with The Atlantic tonight for a look at former President Trump's turbulent week in court and the pro-Palestinian protests erupting across the country. And on PBS News Weekend, how Ecuador went from a model of stability in South America to a hotbed of gang violence and turf wars. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Amir Navaz. On behalf of the entire NewsHour team, thank you for joining us.
On this Friday night, state of emergency. An Ontario First Nation sounds the alarm over a cancer-causing chemical.
It feels like an attack on our community.
Calls to crack down on the company accused of causing the emissions. Air Canada apology. A flight crew accused of mishandling a sacred First Nations headdress.
And they started putting garbage bags on it. It's like, you can't make this stuff up.
The response from passengers and the Prime Minister. Student showdown. The pro-Palestinian movement at American universities grows larger, sparking more clashes on campus. Plus,
These ponies were here and living in the forest prior to colonization.
An Ottawa farm celebrates the arrival of an Ojibwe spirit horse.
Global National with R. Nasser. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. The Ontario First Nation of Aamjiwnaang is under a state of emergency. It was declared in response to high levels of benzene, a cancer-causing chemical, in the air. As we've been reporting, that community is surrounded by industrial plants and has been exposed to high levels of benzene for weeks. Residents there say it's making people sick. The plant accused of causing the emissions is temporarily shutting down. But as Carolyn Jarvis reports, some residents say they have no choice but to leave.
This is my room for the night.
When Samantha Brissett got the news her First Nation had declared a state of emergency, in an hour she had packed up and was gone.
I posted on asking any of my friends if they would take in me, my boyfriend, and my dog and 2 cats, so we could get out of that air.
A hotel in the nearby village of Point Edward became her refuge, and that of countless others.
This little guy lives in North Aamjiwnaang? Yes.
And so you've all evacuated for the night?
Yes.
The north side of Aamjiwnaang, where Samantha lives, lies directly across from a chemical company called Ineos Styrolution. And while there are many industrial plants in the area which pollute, Ontario's Ministry of the Environment stated previously, Ineos is the primary source of significant levels of benzene, a cancer-causing chemical. The annual average limit for benzene in Ontario is 0.45 micrograms per cubic meter. There is no hourly limit. At noon on Thursday, the monitor right across the street from the plant reached the highest 1-hour level seen all month, 191.3. At 4 p.m. it climbed again to 131.7. Among those who fled, Jason Plain.
It feels like an attack on our community. It is sad.
After an outcry from residents last week, Ineos said it would temporarily shut down for maintenance and to address a mechanical issue. On Thursday, the company issued an alert that elevated levels of benzene may occur during the various stages of shutdown, but not this high.
I was literally just there with my dog. I started kind of freaking out in a way because that's a high level.
While all of this was unfolding, representatives from Aamjiwnaang were in Ottawa at an international summit on plastic pollution.
It's worth mentioning that the environment I live in is a result of inadequate regulations, monitoring, and enforcement.
Ontario's Ministry of the Environment issued a provincial order to Ineos 1 week ago to investigate the benzene leak and notify the public of any high levels.
One fear is developing cancer without even knowing I have it.
But after years of exposure to pollution from multiple industrial plants, there is little sense in Aamjiwnaang the government is protecting their health. Carolyn Jarvis, Global News, Toronto.
Air Canada is apologizing after the Assembly of First Nations National Chief says her ceremonial headdress was mishandled during a flight. On Wednesday, the Air Canada crew told Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak that she could not bring her headdress on board the flight. She says the sacred item was unceremoniously wrapped in a plastic bag and sent to the cargo hold. Melissa Ridgen reports on the incident and the reaction from fellow passengers.
Frequent air travel is part of the job for politicians. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak is no different, having racked up her share of airtime since being elected in December, usually with this headdress in tow. A gift from the Blackfoot Confederacy, either stored overhead or under her feet.
I put my headdress with me under the seat in front of me. Standard.
But on a flight from Montreal to Fredericton this week, it wasn't.
The stewardess came and said, "You're not going to leave that there." And then she took it from me.
Staff insisted the sacred item be stowed in cargo, and adding insults,
And they started putting garbage bags on it. Like, you can't make this stuff up.
Air Canada tells Global News the bags were used to protect the case from rain. They've apologized and say the matter is under review, and they will do better.
This was a mistake that I know Air Canada is looking into right now. It is an unfortunate situation that I hope is going to lead to a bit of learning, not just by Air Canada, but a lot of different institutions.
I'm glad it happened to me, not to somebody else. Like, I can't imagine how people would feel in that situation.
Woodhouse Nepenak sees a silver lining in the ordeal. Fellow passengers who tried to intervene.
Canadians did step forward, and they were trying to help, and I really appreciate that. And to all of them that were on the plane, thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Melissa Ridgen, Global News, Winnipeg.
Breaking news from the U.S., where Columbia University's Senate has called for an investigation into that school's leadership. It comes after the university's president brought in police to remove pro-Palestinian student protesters. In its resolution, the Senate says that move undermined the rights and academic freedoms of students and faculty members. The vote was held after more protests erupted outside the campus gates today, with pro-Israeli demonstrators making their voices heard. There are fears of more clashes as those demonstrations spread across the country. Neethu Garcha reports.
With keffiyehs around their necks and signs on tents, the pro-Palestinian movement sweeping campuses across the U.S. has reached the nation's capital, with passionate demonstrations at George Washington University. The now fenced-off encampment of students, faculty, and advocates continued after university officials set a 7 p.m. deadline on the protest. They're asking their universities to drop direct investments in companies doing business in or with Israel, including Amazon, Google, and Microsoft.
We don't want our money to be directly funding a genocide, and we don't want a blood degree after we graduate.
Protesters here say they don't intend to back down and are prepared to get arrested at this demonstration just a few blocks away from the White House, which has rejected the Republican House Speaker's demand to bring in the National Guard to put an end to these protests.
Police confronted demonstrators at multiple campuses deploying a stun gun at Emory University in Atlanta. This moment recorded by CNN Crews, a shout of "I'm a professor" as an Emory University lecturer was forcefully taken to the ground during her arrest. Tensions are boiling over at the University of Southern California. Students reacting after safety concerns led to the unprecedented move of canceling the main graduation ceremony.
They weren't very clear at any point with what the exact security concerns were.
There were dozens of arrests at Indiana University where some protesters, including professors, have been banned from the campus for a year. What they say is free speech, some Jewish students say is hate speech.
Freedom of speech is very important, and I'm very for that, but I think there's a point where the university itself has a duty to protect all of its students, including the Jewish ones. I'm here to tell them the we will not back down, we will not be afraid, we will not be silent.
Security is being ramped up at Columbia University, seen as the epicenter of the movement and the source of inspiration for the latest encampment in D.C. Neethu Garcha, Global News, Washington.
The American protests are now inspiring similar demonstrations in Europe, with students in France blocking access to the Paris Institute of Political Studies. Dozens occupied the main buildings on campus, while others faced off with pro-Israeli demonstrators. Police in Berlin also cleared a protest camp set up in front of German parliament. Activists there demanding an end to arms shipments for the Israeli military. The UN is calling for an urgent, independent investigation into 2 mass graves found at Gaza hospitals. Palestinian officials are exhuming what they say are hundreds of bodies found after Israeli forces withdrew. Now, Israel is denying allegations that its military was responsible. That grisly discovery comes as the world waits for Israel's ground assault on Rafah. Crystal Gamansing reports, and a warning that some of the content is graphic.
As shovels strike the ground and expose remains, unearthing the facts here will be a challenge. A mass grave was identified inside Nasser Medical Complex as this Palestinian civil defense official in the Hamas-run government, adding it was located after people reported not being able to find those they buried. The remains of nearly 200 people have been exhumed so far. There are reports some of the bodies were bound with their hands tied, putting a spotlight on Israel Defense Forces who up until recently were conducting operations around the hospital. Israeli military officials deny having anything to do with the mass grave, saying there were graves at the site previously. It's not known if graves were added before the IDF pulled out of the area.
We are horrified of reports of the mass graves, and we at Save the Children are calling for an urgent independent investigation.
We're absolutely shocked at the destruction here.
Sasha Myers and her team from Save the Children were not able to access the gravesite at the hospital on her recent trip from Rafah to Han Yunis. She says the utter destruction she did see and the disregard for human life leaves her speechless. Myers says people are facing a lack of food, water, sanitation, and the ability to see a future.
They're just focused on surviving the next day, the next hour, the next week, and helping their children to survive. They just can't even see beyond that at the moment. It's just survival.
Survival is the goal, but it's not guaranteed. After burying his brother and sister-in-law, he also buried the couple's premature baby girl. Baby Sabrine was brought into this world with extraordinary efforts, delivered by emergency cesarean section and resuscitated after her mother was killed in an airstrike last weekend in Rafah. A bit of hope that turned into another goodbye. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
An update now on the Montreal family who received the wrong body after their loved one died overseas. 68-year-old Faraj Jarjour died of a heart attack during a family vacation to Cuba last month. And last Friday, the family went to collect his remains and were horrified to discover they belonged to a much younger Russian man. The family has now learned Jarjour's body was mistakenly sent to Russia and then buried there. Global Affairs Canada is working with the family, as well as with Russian diplomatic officials, to locate, exhume, and repatriate the remains. A history-making helping hand. Coming up, the robot helping surgeons perform a delicate operation.
You've got the best deals on delicious food. Order now.
Coke Studio, Season 15.
There's breaking news out of British Columbia tonight. In a major reversal, the province is heeding the growing calls to amend its pilot program on drug decriminalization. That pilot project began back in January 2023 and meant that people caught with small amounts of illicit drugs in public could not be arrested or charged. The province faced criticism from politicians and community groups upset about drug use in public spaces. Police will now be able to make arrests, but only in exceptional circumstances.
That compassion, that concern for people who are struggling does not mean that anything goes. We still have expectations around safety, public spaces, in the coffee shop, on the bus, in the park, on the beach.
And the changes will not recriminalize drug use in private homes or at overdose prevention sites. Well, it's being described as GPS for spine surgery, a first-of-its-kind Canadian medical success story. Dave Mine needed spinal surgery to correct a degenerative condition. Now, normally that procedure requires 2 surgeries, but with the help of a robot, Toronto neurosurgeons were able to carry out a delicate operation more quickly and with less recovery time. Catherine Ward explains.
Throughout his life, Dave Mine has been a man on the move.
I love to hike, mountain bike, starting to golf, and all of that came to an abrupt end.
Back pain and sciatica hit hard in February 2023 because of a degenerative condition in Dave's spine.
It was unbearable, and it was to the point where I couldn't stand on my own 2 legs.
The painful situation, however, took a unique turn a year later, as Dave became the first Canadian to receive a minimally invasive direct lateral procedure on his spine with the help of a robot and a highly trained team. Neurosurgeon Dr. Victor Young explains.
The surgeons are actually performing the procedure, and the robot guides us to the correct location and then maintains the trajectory for us. So it is a bit like having a GPS, but also allowing to guide you to the right location.
Without a robot, the surgery would need to be done in 2 sessions with a much longer recovery time.
We'll be able to do the procedure with the patient in one single position. And so this reduces the time the patient's under anesthesia, and that improves the patient care afterwards.
Dave said he felt better immediately.
The moment I woke up, the pain that had been running down my right leg was completely gone instantly.
Dr. Young says going forward, this kind of technology has an important role to play and potential to be used for more complex procedures.
It's like turning us from carpenters into engineers, that we can have more and more consistent results.
Dave is about a third of the way through the recovery process and says he's able to dream about his future once again.
I was in quite a predicament, and I'm very relieved.
Catherine Ward, Global News, Toronto.
The great critical minerals race still ahead, the scramble to secure key components for Canada's new electric vehicle plants. Welcome back. Honda's $15 billion plan to build new electric vehicle plants in Ontario is re-energizing Canada's auto industry. But mining critical minerals is key to the sector's success. Canada has been hailed as one of the most promising places for battery supply chains. But as Mike Drolet reports, there's a long road ahead.
Toronto-based Electra started reconfiguring this Northern Ontario refinery in 2022 into the only North American cobalt processing facility. At the time, it had no local customers, and all of its refined cobalt was destined to be shipped overseas. But Canada's auto landscape has changed over the past 2 years, creating newfound opportunity.
Yeah, the demand is definitely outweighing our ability to produce within North America, and there's high demand for material that is produced with more than 80% of world cobalt coming out of refineries in China. There's quite a bit of demand for material that's coming outside of China.
While most of the auto industry focus remains on manufacturing, the other half of the supply equation, mining critical minerals, is only now starting to take shape.
And I would tell you that there is enormous progress. There's a new lithium mine that's operating in Quebec. There's another one that has just been approved. There are several others that are actually moving through. That is also true of graphite. That is true of copper. That is true of rare earths.
And automakers are going to great lengths to secure their share. Just yesterday, Mitsubishi closed a deal to own part of Frontier Lithium's Ontario mine. And while Mitsubishi isn't building a battery plant in Ontario, its EV strategic partner Honda is.
It's a lot of it is security of supply, to be honest, because
so it's a minerals race.
It is.
For all the demand, smaller companies like Electra are having difficulty raising funds to complete their projects. With 80% of its refined cobalt supply already spoken for by LG, they don't have much left to leverage.
Conversations are a little bit more strategic now on who we're going to partner with in terms of that last offtake.
The automotive sector may need the manufacturing plants, but a Canadian supply chain needs companies like Electra. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Spirit Horse Celebration. Up next, why there's new hope for a rare breed. Welcome back. An orca calf that spent more than a month stranded in a remote lagoon on Vancouver Island is now free. The Ahatasat First Nation says the orphaned calf made its way over a sandbar with the help of high tide, and rescuers are now trying to encourage the orca towards the open ocean, where her calls may be heard by her pod. There are also increased patrols and protective measures to ensure the whale avoids contact with boats and people. An Ottawa farm is celebrating a rare event, the birth of a new Ojibwe spirit horse. Now, most horse breeds register tens of thousands of new births every year, but the Ojibwe Horse Society gets excited if there are a dozen foals born in a year, and estimate there are only about 200 of those horses in the world. Abigail Beeman tells us more about these special animals.
Meet Asema. His name means tobacco, named for one of 4 indigenous sacred medicines, like his mom, sweetgrass. Born last month to the delight of Ottawa's Medawaki farm.
Our elders' teachings tell us that they lived in connection with our community since time immemorial. So, these ponies were here and living in the forest prior to colonization. Hi.
Even though she's been in both the equestrian and indigenous cultural tourism worlds for years, Trina Samard only learned about Ojibwe spirit horses during the pandemic, and then went on a mission, growing the number on her farm to 9.
They do have an extra nose flap in here to keep out all of the cold weather.
The breed, also known as the Lac La Croix indigenous pony, has several attributes that help in the Canadian winter, such as hairy ears and a thick layer of hair under the mane. They also have a telltale dorsal stripe and friendly nature.
The horses really suffered
from the effects of colonization.
News of the new foal has spread wide in the small but dedicated spirit horse community in North America. The breed was once considered a nuisance or health hazard for roaming freely, hunted until there were just 4 mares left in the 1970s who were spirited away to the U.S. in a movie-like plot. Today, volunteers work hard to grow the numbers of the people-loving little horses.
We only have about 25 breeding stallions in the entire breed and about 60 to 70 mares, so it's perilous, honestly.
There you go. For now, there is simply joy watching this foal explore his new world.
I just think he's going to be a really, really special boy, and maybe he'll continue to be a stud or a stallion, and be part of bringing future generations forward.
Samard hopes of a future where the Ojibwe spirit horse can roam wild again, happy to play a small role in rebuilding the special breed and inviting the public to her farm to learn more. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
And that is Global National for this Friday. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is the fields of Giroux, Manitoba. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.
If it's Friday, the second and third witnesses take the stand and
our dedication to bringing Asia to the world. This is Asia Now.
It's 12 p.m. in Singapore and Hong Kong, 9:30 in New Delhi and 11 o'clock in Jakarta. I'm Shahida Othman. At this hour, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken wrapping up his visit to China after meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping. They held talks over Russia, Taiwan and trade. Beijing urging Washington to stop hyping what he calls false narrative of Chinese overcapacity. Pentagon announces $6 billion military aid for Ukraine, its largest security assistance to Kyiv so far. The latest tranche of weapons will include more Patriot missiles, HIMARS and counter-drone systems. Plus,
it's been more than a week since this encampment here at Columbia University was set up, and it's still going strong despite several rounds of negotiations between the university and the protesters here.
Rallies and protests intensify across U.S. university campuses against the war in Gaza. Several schools have called the police on protesters, leading to the arrest of hundreds. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has concluded his 3-day visit to China aimed at keeping tense bilateral ties under control. His talks with President Xi Jinping and Foreign Minister Wang Yi focused on a range of issues, including trade, on which Beijing reiterated its concerns on what it considers U.S. pressure to curb its economy.
停止炒作中国产能过剩论的虚假叙事，撤销对中国企业的非法制裁，停止加征违反世贸组织规则的301关税。
The comment came after Mr. Blinken said he had raised concerns over China's trade practices and industrial overcapacity during his talks with Chinese leadership. Mr. Blinken also called on Beijing to use its position on the global stage to help facilitate peace, particularly in the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. He emphasized that Moscow would struggle to continue its war against Kyiv without China's help.
I reiterated our serious concern about the PRC providing components that are powering Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. China is the top supplier of machine tools, microelectronics, nitrocellulose, which is critical to making munitions and rocket propellants, and other dual-use items that Moscow is using to ramp up its defense industrial base. A defense industrial base that is churning out rockets, drones, tanks, and other weapons that President Putin is using to invade a sovereign country, to demolish its power grid and other civilian infrastructure, to kill innocent children, women, and men.
Mr. Blinken was in talks with the Chinese president yesterday. Beijing said bilateral relations had stabilized from further deterioration. President Xi hailed the progress made, though he added that a number of issues remain. He said both sides should seek common ground while reserving their differences instead of engaging in vicious competition.
中方乐见一个自信、开放、繁荣发展的美国，希望各方面积极正面看待中国的发展。这个根本问题解决了，第一课以后做好了，中美关系才会真正向前走。
Our correspondent Olivia Seong explains where the bilateral ties between China and the U.S. stand.
If we were to compare this trip to the last trip that Secretary Blinken made to China about a year ago, it would seem that there is improvement. That last trip more focused on restarting dialogue between the two countries following what seemed like a freefall in relations. This time, keywords being used by both sides are progress and stability. And we also learned that there was some tangible outcome. Secretary Blinken saying that both sides will hold their first talks on artificial intelligence. They also talked more about boosting people-to-people ties, particularly in the educational sector. President Xi also striking a rather cordial tone. State media reporting that he said that China is willing to cooperate, but he also said that cooperation needs to be a two-way street. And when it comes to competition, he also said that this cannot be a zero-sum game. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi adding that if issues are not addressed, there is a risk of relations going back into this downward spiral again. Ironically, both sides there agreeing that there are issues that they still have to address. But if we look at how both sides are presenting this visit, it would seem that they are talking past each other on some very fundamental strategic issues, which doesn't seem to have moved the needle that much.
The U.S. says it will provide Ukraine with more Patriot missiles for its air defense systems. This is under a $6 billion security aid Pentagon announced yesterday.
This is the largest security assistance package that we've committed to date. It will include critical interceptors for Ukraine's Patriot and NASAMS air defense systems, more counter-drone systems and support equipment, significant amounts of artillery ammunition and air-to-ground munitions, and maintenance and sustainment support.
The latest assistance follows another $1 billion aid package announced earlier this week. That aid is likely to get to Ukraine quickly as it is being drawn from Pentagon stocks. The new assistance, however, could take longer as it will be procured from the defense industry. Ukraine says the U.S. delay in approving military aid has proven costly for its forces.
Although in half a year, while we were waiting for a decision on the American support, the Russian army managed to seize the initiative on the battlefield. We can still now not only stabilize the front, but also move forward, achieving our Ukrainian goals in the war.
Egypt is attempting to restart talks to end the war in Gaza. A delegation from the country met with Israeli counterparts with a proposal for the release of 33 hostages by Hamas. Now, Israel is reportedly willing to consider a limited truce for this. An earlier proposal was for 40 hostages to be released. That is out of 133 remaining hostages still being held after being forcibly taken in the Hamas raid on 7th of October. Egypt's attempt comes as Israel threatens to move forward with invading Rafah, a move which could send desperate Palestinian refugees fleeing from the conflict from Gaza into neighboring Egypt. A pro-Palestinian student group at Columbia University said negotiations with its school have hit an impasse. They are calling for the school to divest from organizations that work with Israel and to become more transparent with its investments. Sally Patterson with more.
Well, it's been more than a week since this encampment here at Columbia University was set up, and it's still going strong despite several rounds of negotiations between the university and the protesters here. This group are saying they are refusing to be moved unless those conditions are heard. As you can see, it spreads way back towards that building with many, many tents set up. There are people gathered, people sat around talking, many of them covering their faces and their heads in order to not be recognized or seen. Only a few different representatives of the demonstration are able to speak to the media. The rest have been told by the leaders not to do so because they obviously want a very clear and key narrative coming out, and they're trying to keep that as uniform as possible. Now, negotiations between the university and the demonstration here haven't really reached enough success for either side to be happy. The protesters here say they want a couple of things from the college. Firstly, they want complete divestment, complete boycott of Israel and Israeli companies. They say they won't be moved until that happens. They also want transparency in where the university's money is going. They say that tuition fees and other funding that the university gets should be clear for everyone to see. They want a record of where that money's going. And finally, what they say is they want amnesty for any of the students who were either arrested or those brought into internal disciplinary procedures because of the ongoing demonstrations that we've seen here for more than a week now. Now, outside earlier, we were speaking to one of the major counter demonstrations here in New York City. We were speaking to people holding Israeli flags, holding American flags, many of them holding pictures of the hostages who are continuing to be kept inside Gaza. They say that they want release of those hostages by Hamas immediately, and many of them say what's going on here is actually for them anti-Semitic.
A lot of the rhetoric out there is anti-Semitic, misguided, and frankly just offensive. I think that there's a double standard in the world.
We should make a distinction between the discomfort of disagreement on political ideologies, such as like settler colonialism, right? And and these notions of like feeling fear for physical violence.
We have seen increased escalations with clashes between the police and with protesters, not just here in New York City, but actually across the United States. In Austin, Texas, for example, we saw law enforcement show up in full riot gear. We saw some arrests in other parts of the country with tasers being used, with tear gas allegedly used as well. So some concern from demonstrators that law enforcement and indeed universities are using a heavy hand. But they're actually worried about timing, and that's because right now is a lead up to graduations. So many universities are preparing for their students to graduate after their time here at university. Preparations are underway across here. And so now really it's a race against time because the university is keen to ensure that the year can wrap up as planned. It's almost the end of the final semester. Here at Columbia, some of the teaching has already gone online for the rest of the year, going into a hybrid model so that students don't have to come onto campus. But as things stand, there's been no real resolution to this situation playing out here in the US. Sally Patterson, CNA, New York.
And staying stateside, U.S. President Joe Biden and his Republican opponent Donald Trump could face off in a series of debates in their race to the White House. The Democratic president said he would be happy to debate with Mr. Trump. It is the first time he has clearly agreed to a debate in this race with elections due in November. In recent weeks, Mr. Trump has been challenging Mr. Biden to a 1-to-1 match. His aides have called for holding more than the usual 3 debates.
I just want to say that I've invited Biden to debate. He can do it anytime he wants. I'm ready. Here we are.
Ahead on Asia now, more political turmoil in Vietnam as the chairman of the country's parliament resigns. And later, we look ahead to the final leaders' retreat between Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Indonesian President Joko Widodo, set to take place early next week.
East Asia, a region steeped in history, now helping to write the future of our world.
From the corridors of power to the region's most remote corners, we'll break down the news driving some of the world's largest economies and explain why it matters.
South Africa will mark 30 years of freedom this Saturday, April 27th, as the country remembers the day in 1994 when millions cast their vote in South Africa's first ever democratic elections. 87-year-old Lily Makanya recalled the excitement she felt at the time. I didn't sleep at night. I was excited because we were going to vote. I knew that Mandela was going to take office after we had voted, and we were going to get our freedom. Nelson Mandela was elected as the country's first black president after years of white minority rule, offering the hope of a new, more equal South Africa. For those who experienced apartheid, the suffering of those years remains etched in their collective memory. I cannot forget how we suffered at the hands of whites. In the city at night, there were white bikers with hair like this, who would brutally assault a black person if they saw them walking on a pavement. Those white boys were cruel. That day in 1994 represented a turning point. However, much of the optimism of that period has since subsided, as South Africa faces several challenges, including widening inequality. Even at the school that I voted in, there has been a lot of changes. So I'm happy, even though my heart is at pain with all that is happening lately. But I'm so happy and excited. It is taking me back just thinking about 1994. Black people's houses were full of excitement. South Africa will head to the polls on May 29th in what is likely to be one of the country's most fiercely contested elections.
Lawyers representing the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, are writing to Apple CEO Tim Cook, demanding answers on the sourcing of minerals used to manufacture the company's products. The lawyers shared concerns that Apple's supply chain may be tainted by blood minerals, those obtained through unethical mining practices from the DRC. Led by Robert Amsterdam in Washington, D.C. and William Burden in Paris, the group of lawyers also wrote to Apple subsidiaries in France, demanding a response within 3 weeks. The statement coincided with the release of a report by the law firm accusing Rwanda and private entities of laundering 3T and other conflict minerals from Congo. The DR Congo is the world's leading producer of tantalum. It is also the #1 producer of copper and cobalt, a key ingredient in electric batteries. Most of Congo's mineral resources are concentrated in the east, where insecurity has worsened since M23 made a major comeback in March 2022.
Togo will head to the polls Monday in legislative elections that follow a series of government crackdowns on opposition protests and the passing of a controversial new constitution that could allow the president to stay in power indefinitely.
Nyasimbe's party, with the majority in parliament, has passed a constitution which Nyasimbe himself is yet to sign upon, which will have parliament choose the president instead of a direct vote by people. This has been criticized by civil society organizations and opposition supporters as anti-democratic, as it would allow Nyasimbe to essentially stay in power indefinitely. Heading into the election, opposition protests have banned foreign reporters forbidden from covering the election, and the Catholic Church barred from serving as observers. Monday's vote would give the opposition a chance to gain more seats in parliament, which could give them more say on major policy changes like the passing of a new constitution. However, if President Nyasimbe signs off on the constitutional changes before the election Monday, whatever new parliament is assembled after the vote will no longer have a say.
President Faure Nyasimbe took power in 2005 after his father's death. The family has been running the West African country for 6 decades, making it one of the longest ruling families in Africa. Haiti's Transitional Council was sworn in on Thursday, following the official resignation earlier in the day of Prime Minister Ariel Henry. Amidst the sound of sporadic gunfire coming from outside the National Palace, the newly appointed interim Prime Minister said that the 9-member council was a Haitian solution to a crisis that has gone on too long. Today is an important day in the life of our dear Republic. This day, in effect, opens a view to a solution, the fundamental objective of which is to address the multi-dimensional crisis that the country is experiencing, with a view to arriving at a definitive outcome. The Council is expected to help set the agenda of a new cabinet, as well as appoint a provisional electoral commission. Its mandate runs until February 7th, 2026, when a new president will be sworn in.
And the whole world is waiting anxiously for the next step.
Tens of thousands expected at anti-violence marches across the country today. Police will soon have access to real-time information on firearms after the federal government committed millions to a national register.
Yes, it is a lot of money, but it's going to be a very worthwhile outcome.
A 30-year-old man found dead after a drive-by shooting in Melbourne's southeast. And King Charles III to resume public-facing duties next week after stepping back due to cancer treatment. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Dan Walsher. Thousands of people are rallying across the country this weekend, calling on the federal government to declare a national emergency over violence against women. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is set to join a rally in the nation's capital tomorrow. He says the New South Wales, South Australian and Victorian premiers have all agreed there should be a discussion at National Cabinet about what he describes as a scourge of violence against women. Attorney General Mark Dreyfus has described it as an epidemic and says it has to stop.
We all need to step up. We need to do more about it. What these rallies are about are reflecting that level of community distress. The Prime Minister plans to attend one of these rallies tomorrow, and I plan to attend one of these rallies in Melbourne. It's going to be held tomorrow, and I understand that a number of my federal colleagues are planning to do the same thing because we stand with the community in standing against male violence.
Ballarat and Newcastle hosted gatherings last night in response to the deaths of 26 women allegedly killed by men in Australia so far this year.
From my perspective, I'm coming here to take a stand, to show solidarity with my local community and with also everyone who's experienced domestic, family or sexual violence.
Thousands of protesters are taking to the streets in Sydney as part of the nationwide campaign. Organisers say domestic violence has reached crisis levels and they want change. Our reporter Lydia Feng is at the rally and joins us now live. Lydia, what's the mood where you are?
Good afternoon, Dan. Well, it's a very passionate protest here, but also relatively peaceful. Hundreds of women, men and children gathered at Belmore Park, not far from here, about an hour ago. They've since marched through the city, and we're now here at Hyde Park, where many people have gathered. Obviously, there is a lot of emotion here. People have personal stories to share, or they've seen media reports about women being killed at the hands of their partner. Many people here say that they want change. A lot of people have been chanting here. They've been holding signs, and we'll shortly hear some speeches. All of them say that they want to see some change happen.
I'm here basically to support women's rights and to put out a message that it comes down to educating our sons. I shouldn't have to tell my daughter how to dress, how to act, what to say, but I tell my son how to treat women and what relationships should be like. I'm here today because I think the government needs to declare this devastating thing that's happening to women as a national emergency. Enough women have died, 26, and it's really, really upsetting.
And a lot of politicians are here as well. We've seen the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns, as well as the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull.
We have to have a society in which women are safe. In fact, all of us are safe. But we need legislative changes, legal changes, but above all, we need cultural change. And that's why I've always quoted the wise words Lucy said years ago, which is that not all disrespect of women leads to violence against women, but that's where all violence against women begins.
Now, Lydia, talk us through what sparks the campaign.
Well, this is a nationwide campaign. Rallies are also being held today in Adelaide and Hobart, and more will be held tomorrow with the Prime Minister attending the one in Canberra. The recent deaths of women in Australia have sparked these nationwide protests. In particular, the recent murders of women in Bondi Junction at that stabbing attack. We also saw Samantha Murphy being murdered at Ballarat in Victoria, and most recently, Molly Ticehurst in central New South Wales in Forbes. Organisers here say enough is enough and they want change. They want the government to recognise this as a national emergency.
Lydia Feng reporting from Sydney. The federal government is committing more than $161 million over the next 4 years to establish a national firearms register. The funding would ensure all state and territory licensing and record keeping is digitised, allowing police and law enforcement agencies to access the information in real time. Political reporter Matthew Dorton has more from Parliament House in Canberra.
This pre-budget announcement is a long time coming. It's being made on the eve of the 28th anniversary of the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, where 35 people were killed, and more than a year after another incident in the Queensland town of Weambla, where 2 police officers and a member of the community were killed by a man who had a suspended gun licence. The issue at hand here, despite this being on the radar of governments of all political persuasions at all levels of government for almost 3 decades, is that there's been this patchwork of legislation across the country, each state and territory addressing this issue in very different ways and also keeping records in very different ways. And until now, it appears that that has been a significant challenge to get past. What we know is that in December last year, the Prime Minister, Premiers and Chief Ministers did agree on a way forward how to actually put in place this National Firearms Register, which would do 2 things. First of all, it's going to bring that information gathering in every state and territory up to the same level. We know that in some states that information is already digitised and ready to go. In other states, they are still relying on paper-based systems kept in filing cabinets in various government departments. This funding will go towards bringing every state and territory up to the same level and also allowing that information to be accessed by police and law enforcement agencies across the country in near real time to ensure that they are getting that information when they need it. For example, if they are showing up to an incident like the one in Weambla back in December 2022, knowing what they could be facing when they arrive at a property like that. We know that the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus says that this was of course fuelled in the first instance by that Port Arthur massacre, but the incident back in December 2022 really served as a turning point in the thoughts for state and territory governments and the Commonwealth, and he says that this is a welcome development today.
It took 3 decades because this was a complicated piece of the puzzle. Each state and territory is responsible for their own firearms laws. Each state and territory has quite different arrangements for registration of firearms licensing, and it's taken this long to get all state and territory governments. We put our effort into it. As I said, a catalyst was the shocking events at Weambla. I was very pleased when in December last year the National Cabinet agreed on this National Firearms Register.
And Matthew, what reaction has there been so far?
Dan, it is important to point out that there is broad political support for this register, even though it has taken a number of years to get it off the ground. The federal opposition today welcoming this funding commitment in the budget, funding that will be spent over the next 4 years to get this register up and running. Dan Tehan, one of the members of Peter Dutton's shadow cabinet, saying if it could even be achieved quicker than that, then that also would be a welcome development.
Well, obviously, we would love it to be in place tomorrow, but it's getting the systems together from each state and territory and being able to bring those systems together nationally, and that takes time. Let's hope that it mightn't take 4 years. I think all of us would welcome it if it was ready tomorrow, but bringing all those systems together does take time, and the most important thing is that we get it right.
DNT, and speaking in Melbourne earlier today, we have also heard, very importantly, from the Alana and Madeline Foundation. This is the organisation that was founded by Walter Mikak after he lost his wife and their two daughters, Alana and Madeline, in the Port Arthur massacre back in 1996. The foundation saying today that this is welcome news, that it reflects almost 3 decades of advocacy in this space, and saying that this is the final step in fully achieving the National Firearms Agreement, which was set out in 1996 by then Prime Minister John Howard. Dan?
Matthew Dorn reporting from Parliament House in Canberra. Victorian police are investigating after a man was killed in a drive-by shooting in Melbourne's southeast. Reporter Leanne Wong has more from Hampton Park.
Well, detectives remain on scene here at Bride Avenue in Hampton Park after a fatal drive-by shooting overnight. Now, local residents say they heard multiple gunshots at about 12:30 last night, and not long after, a 30-year-old man from Cranbourne was found in a car with gunshot wounds, where he unfortunately died. Police say a Ford Ute was seen leaving the area, but investigations remain ongoing. This morning, crime scene investigators scoured the road looking for evidence. They're also examining a silver Volkswagen Golf, which as of a short time ago has been towed away. But the shooting has really rattled local residents who say that they've never seen anything like this happen before.
So the moment I just got into bed, I reckon around 12:22, that's when I heard 4 gunshots. I was pretty sure it was gunshots and not fireworks or anything. We usually do hear sounds like that, but this was like really a gunshot.
Now, a burnt-out vehicle was also found about 2 hours after last night's shooting at Sweeney Reserve, about a couple suburbs away from here in Berwick. Police say they're also investigating whether or not that burnt-out car is linked to last night's shooting.
A 6th teenager has been charged with a terrorism offence following raids across southwest Sydney on Wednesday. The 15-year-old boy is accused of conspiring to engage in preparing or planning a terrorist act. He's been refused bail to appear at a children's court later today. 5 other teenagers, aged 14 to 17, were charged earlier in the week with several offences. After successfully undergoing initial stages of cancer treatment, King Charles is planning a return to public duties. Despite his comeback, the palace hasn't commented on what engagements he will attend and whether his trip to Australia will go ahead later this year.
This portrait taken earlier this month to mark the first anniversary of his coronation as king, but it wasn't the year he'd been expecting. The palace has been rocked by months of health scares, but now some good news. The king's well enough to return to some public duties after 12 weeks of cancer treatment.
It's great that he's on the mend and going to be back fighting fit and back out, looking after the nation like he's always been doing.
King Charles was last seen smiling on Easter Sunday in Windsor. His medical team have given him the go-ahead to start filling his diary, but with a scaled-back schedule. The first official engagement, a trip to a cancer clinic with the Queen next week.
You haven't got 2 codes.
This is definitely much needed good news for the royals. I mean, it's been a really, really rocky start to 2024 for the royal family. This double blow of this dual cancer health diagnosis of 2 of our principals, 2 of our most well-loved royals, has been really hard.
But his therapy isn't over, and there's no indication on when he'll be cleared. News of the King's return came in a statement from Buckingham Palace. His Majesty is greatly encouraged to be resuming some public-facing duties and very grateful to his medical team for their continued care and expertise. Future engagements will be adjusted to make sure his condition isn't compromised. After 3 months behind the scenes and the shocking cancer diagnosis of his daughter-in-law, Princess Catherine, this move by the palace to offer an update on his recovery is a clear sign it's trying to reassure the public the monarchy is on stable ground.
In January, I underwent major abdominal surgery in London.
The palace provided no update on the condition of Princess Catherine. She revealed last month that she was undergoing treatment for cancer. Before his diagnosis, King Charles was expected to travel to Australia for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting later this year. While that wasn't ruled out, any future plans will remain subject to doctor's orders. Catherine Dix, ABC News, London.
And a warning, this next report contains confronting images. A baby in Gaza who was rescued from her dying mother's womb after an Israeli airstrike has died. Baby Sabrine Al-Sakani was delivered by caesarean section in a hospital in Rafah shortly after midnight on Sunday.
In this fragile form, a tiny pulse of hope. Baby Sabrine was the last survivor of a family obliterated by an Israeli airstrike. The pregnant mum was pulled from here. But minutes later in hospital, doctors were able to rescue Sabrine from her dying mother's womb. They tapped to stimulate her breathing. Air was pumped into her lungs. Then to an incubator, fighting for life. Notice the gentleness of the doctor as he cradles her head. Relatives watched over the newborn. Paternal grandmother, Ahlam, planned to take care of the orphaned baby.
I will raise her in the best way. She's the memory of her dad. I hope that God gives her a long life.
Sabrine fought to live. 2 days ago, briefly opening her eyes. 24 hours later, her condition still critical. Baby Sabrine lost her struggle. At midday yesterday, the dead child was brought home to her people. Sabrine was buried alongside her mother, after whom she was named, her father Shukri, and 3-year-old sister Malak. Today, her uncle Rami prayed at Sabrine's grave. Overhead, Gaza lived for 5 days.
The second phase of India's parliamentary elections is underway, with voting taking place in nearly 90 constituencies across 13 states. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's seeking a third term in office, and his rivals have campaigned on religious discrimination, affirmative action and taxes. Almost 1 billion people are eligible to vote in 7-phase general elections that run until June. A Perth diver who's been surveying historic shipwrecks off the West Australian coast has made a curious discovery. Some of the wrecks aren't where they're supposed to be, and now there are efforts to document the precise location of the shipwrecks to ensure they're protected into the future.
This is all that remains of the Zadora and its crew. It sank off the Perth coast almost 150 years ago. It's one of many historic wrecks John Checky has surveyed in the area.
We want to know what things look like, what the story is, where they are, so we can help interpret them, we can tell the story, we can help preserve them for future generations. We monitor how's the degradation going on the water. Are they getting buried? Are they getting exposed?
He's diving his way through a WA Museum published book of historic wrecks.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Woodman. Have a good life.